Don't stay here, they are coming for you.
Who? What do you mean?
The crystal glass of 20-year-old Hibiki was halfway to seal Taehwan's lips when the air in the room seemed to crystallize. It was a sensation he had lived by for decades, the sudden, prickling weight of a mountain about to move. He sat in the center of his reinforced sanctuary, surrounded by men whose only job was to be his shield. Yet he was the first to feel the coldness of the vacuum. A tiny, crimson spark materialized on the lapel of his dark navy suit. It was no larger than a ladybug, a silent, flickering bead of light that danced upward until it settled with terrifying precision over his heart. To any other man, it might have been a trick of the light from the mansion's chandeliers. To Taehwan, it was the 0-second mark, the final heartbeat before the world splintered. His bodyguards were looking at the heavy oak doors, their hands twitching toward their holsters in anticipation of a physical breach, but they were blind to the ghost in the window. Only So-rin, the girl whose name he barely knew, was looking in the right direction. She stood to his left, her hands steady as she poured a fresh glass of water, her white blouse a stark contrast to the shadows of the room. She didn't scream. A scream would have been too slow. In the time it took for Taehwan's brain to register the scent of the whiskey, So-rin moved with the desperate, jagged grace of someone who had practiced for a moment she hoped would never come. She lunged, not away from him, but directly into his personal space. Her hands, surprisingly warm and calloused from labor, seized his face, pulling him forward and down. The shock of the contact, the sudden, fragrant proximity of her skin, short-circuited his legendary composure. The glass slipped from his fingers, amber liquid splashing across the white linen, but before he could shove her away, her lips crashed against his. It wasn't a gesture of romance. It was a violent, tactical displacement of his vitals. The sound followed the movement by a fraction of a millisecond. Crack. The reinforced glass of the mansion window didn't just break. It atomized. A high-velocity round hissed through the space where Taehwan's chest had been a heartbeat prior, punching a jagged hole through the leather back of his chair and burying itself in the mahogany wall behind him. The air was suddenly filled with the scent of ozone and shattered crystal. Taehwan remained frozen, his hands hovering mid-air, the taste of salt and iron on his lips. Above him, the red laser dot swept frantically across the wall, searching for a target that had vanished into the shadow of a waitress's embrace. In that singular, breathless moment, the most powerful man in the city realized his life had just been bought for the price of a single, desperate breath. The sound of the gunshot was still echoing through the cavernous room when the silence of the mansion curdled into something far more dangerous. The world had truly frozen. Shards of the shattered window, suspended for a heartbeat in the air like falling diamonds, finally clattered against the parquet floor. Taehwan sat motionless, his back pressed against the chair that now bore the jagged exit wound of a bullet meant for his skull. In an instant, the room erupted in a chaotic, synchronized blur of black suits. His bodyguards, humiliated by their own failure to detect the threat, reacted with the violent desperation of men who had lost control. The air was filled with the metallic snap of safeties being disengaged and the harsh, rhythmic thud of combat boots. Within seconds, the barrel of a Glock 17 was pressed against So-rin's temple. Another was shoved under her chin, forcing her head back. She was small, caught in the crosshairs of 4 elite killers, her white apron stained with the expensive whiskey she had spilled in her lunge to save him. The guards' faces were masks of predatory rage, their fingers twitching. They didn't see a savior. They saw a breach in their perimeter. A waitress who had touched the untouchable Seol Taehwan during an assassination attempt. "Don't move," the lead guard hissed, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Hands behind your head, or I'll end you where you stand." Taehwan didn't look at his men. He didn't look at the shattered window or the red laser that had finally blinked out in the darkness outside. His gaze was locked entirely on So-rin. He expected to see a girl trembling with the weight of her choice, or perhaps the flushed, frantic look of a woman swept up in a romantic fantasy of rescue. Instead, he found himself staring into eyes that were unnervingly cold and clinical. Even with a gun barrel bruising her skin, Sorin's pupils weren't dilated with fear. She wasn't looking at him with love. She was looking at him with the detached intensity of a witness reporting facts to a superior. Her breathing was shallow but rhythmic. Her hands held out in a gesture that wasn't a plea for mercy, but a request for order. "The shot came from 300 yards out," she said, her voice cutting through the tension with a terrifying, level clarity. "South-southwest. Elevation 40 feet. If you stand up now, the second shooter will have the angle." Taejuan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind whistling through the broken glass. He raised a single hand, a silent command that stopped the guards' hearts. He realized then that the mansion wasn't just frozen by the attack. It was frozen by the revelation that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the sniper outside, but the girl holding his gaze with the eyes of a soldier. The silence of the private study was heavier than the chaos of the dining hall. Here, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and expensive tobacco, a sanctuary usually reserved for the quiet execution of business. Taejuan sat behind his monolithic desk, the shadows cast by the singular desk lamp carving deep valleys into his sharp features. Across from him, Sorin stood. She had refused the chair, standing instead with her hands clasped loosely in front of her stained apron. The guns were gone, dismissed by a flick of Taejuan's wrist, but the tension remained, vibrating like a plucked wire. Taejuan watched her for a long time, his intense, alert eyes searching for the crack in her foundation. He looked for the tremor in her fingers or the darting gaze of a common girl who had just stared down a sniper's barrel and a mafia boss's wrath. But there was nothing. She looked less like a waitress and more like a statue carved from the very same marble as his foyer. "You knew the caliber," Taejuan said finally, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate the whiskey glass on his desk. "You knew the trajectory. You didn't just see a laser dot, Sorin. You were calculating the windage." He leaned forward, the light catching the silver of his wristwatch. A girl who pours water in a mansion doesn't speak like a spotter for a precision team. "Who sent you? Was the kiss a distraction for the first shot, or a failed attempt to get close enough to finish the job yourself?" Sorin didn't flinch. She didn't offer a frantic denial or a plea for her life. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a gesture so familiar it caused a sharp, forgotten ache in the back of Taejuan's mind. "I wasn't waiting for the shot, Seol Taejuan," she said, her voice devoid of the subservient lilt she had used all evening. "I was waiting for you to look at me, truly look at me, but you only see what you expect to see. Waitresses, bodyguards, enemies. You've forgotten the faces of the people who died to build this desk you're sitting behind." She stepped forward, entering the small circle of light. The clinical coldness in her eyes shifted, revealing a burning, ancient embers of recognition. "My father used to say your greatest weakness was your pride in your peripheral vision. He said you were so focused on the horizon that you'd never notice the viper at your feet." Taejuan's heart hammered against his ribs, a rare, unwelcome sensation. The way she stood, the cadence of her speech, it was a ghost come to life. He reached into the top drawer, his fingers brushing against a weathered photograph he hadn't looked at in 15 years. In it, a younger Taejuan stood beside a man with the same determined, unyielding brow as the girl in front of him. "Min-ho," Taejuan whispered, the name tasting like ash. "He's been dead for 10 years, Sorin replied, her voice finally cracking with the weight of a decade of silence. "And you're the reason why. I didn't kiss you because I love you. I kissed you because I'm not done with you yet, and a dead man can't give me the truth." The heavy mahogany doors of the study groaned as Taejuan's head of technical intelligence, a man known only as Park, entered with the frantic energy of someone carrying a live grenade. The revelation of Sorin's lineage still hung in the air like thick smoke, but the digital reality of the hit was already manifesting on the tablet Park slid across the desk. Taehwan didn't look away from Sorin as he tapped the screen. The device displayed a wireframe map of the estate and the surrounding ridgeline. A jagged, pulsing red line traced the bullet's path from the shattered dining room window back to a rocky outcrop 300 yards to the south-southwest, exactly where the waitress had indicated. "We recovered the casing, Chairman," Park whispered, his eyes darting nervously towards Sorin, who remained as still as a ghost in the shadows. "It's a .338 Lapua. But it's not the caliber that's the problem. It's the signature on the encryption." Taehwan finally looked down, his brow furrowing as he scrolled through the data logs. To maintain his empire, every weapon assigned to his security detail was fitted with a biometric lock and a localized GPS tracker. It was a system designed to ensure total loyalty, a digital leash that turned his men into an extension of his own will. The blood in Taehwan's veins turned to ice as he reached the final page of the report. The rifle used in the attempt hadn't been smuggled onto the grounds by an outside assassin. According to the internal server, the weapon had been checked out of the mansion's own armory less than an hour before the dinner meeting. Even more damning was the authorization code used to bypass the biometric failsafe. "The credentials used were level 5, Park said, his voice trembling. "Only 3 people in this organization have that clearance." Taehwan's mind raced through the faces of his inner circle, the men who had sat at his table, the men who had just failed to see the red dot on his chest. He realized with a sickening jolt that the chaos in the dining room hadn't been a lapse in training. It had been a coordinated performance. The bodyguards hadn't been slow to react. They had been waiting for the bullet to find its mark before finishing the job under the guise of returning fire. He looked up at Sorin. She didn't look surprised. Her gaze remained fixed on the photograph of her father, a silent accusation of the rot Taehwan had allowed to grow at the heart of his power. "The call is coming from inside the house," Sorin said softly, her words echoing the digital evidence on the desk. Taehwan stood slowly, the silver of his wristwatch catching the dim light. He had spent years building a fortress to keep the world out, only to realize he had spent a decade locking himself in with his own executioners. The mansion wasn't just frozen. It was a tomb, and the keys were in the hands of the people he trusted most. Taehwan reached across the desk, his movements slow and deliberate, as if any sudden gesture might cause the ghost before him to vanish. He picked up the tablet, but his thumb brushed against the edge of the old photograph instead. The man in the picture, Min-ho, had been more than a mentor. He had been the architect of Taehwan's early rise, a man who navigated the underworld with a moral compass that eventually became a target. "You have his eyes," Taehwan murmured, his voice cracking the clinical silence of the study. "But Min-ho told me his daughter was safe in Canada. He told me he'd sent her away to a life where the name Seol Taehwan would never be whispered." Sorin reached into the deep pocket of her black waist apron. For a heartbeat, Park tensed, his hand hovering near his holster. But Taehwan stopped him with a sharp glance. She didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, she withdrew a small, laminated identification card and a weathered notebook bound in cracked leather. She laid them on the mahogany surface. The ID card bore a different name, a nameless face for a nameless waitress, but the notebook was unmistakable. It was Min-ho's ledger, not of debts or hits, but of observations. "I never went to Canada," she said, her voice a steady, chilling current. "I stayed. I watched from the periphery while you climbed higher on the ladder he built. I took jobs in the kitchens of your associates, cleaned the floors of your shell companies, and waited. Because my father didn't die in a car accident, Taehwan. He died because he found the same rot in the armory that you just discovered on that tablet." She stepped closer, the light from the desk lamp illuminating the faint scars on her hands, burns and cuts not from combat, but from years of disappearing into the grueling, invisible labor of the service industry. It was the ultimate disguise. In a world of power-hungry titans, no one ever looks at the person refilling the water glass. I've spent 3 years investigating the accident that took him, she continued. I tracked the requisition orders for the vehicle's brake lines. They were signed off by the same level 5 clearance that just tried to put a bullet in your heart tonight. I didn't save you out of loyalty. I saved you because you are the only one left with the authority to open the vaults I can't reach. You are the key to the men who murdered my father. Taejuan looked from the ledger to the girl. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She had been living in the shadows of his own mansion, a predator disguised as prey, calculating the windage of his downfall while he remained blinded by his own navy-suited grandeur. The waitress wasn't just a witness. She was a living debt he had never paid, and the interest had finally come due. Taejuan stood by the window, staring out at the jagged Monterey coastline where the moonlight fractured against the black waves. Behind him, the room remained a tomb of secrets. He felt the weight of the silver wristwatch on his arm, a reminder of a life measured in precision and control, and realized that for the first time in 20 years, he was no longer the one holding the stopwatch. He turned back to Sorin. She hadn't moved. She stood with the same unyielding posture her father had once possessed, a living ghost demanding an accounting. You want the truth about the night Min Ho died, Taejuan said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. But the truth is a debt that usually ends in blood. If I give it to you, you won't be able to go back to being a nameless face in a crowd. You'll be a target just like me. I've been a target since the day I was born, Chairman, she replied, the title sounding like a mockery in her mouth. The only difference is that now, I'm the one looking through the scope. You have the codes. You have the logs. But you don't have the eyes. You haven't spent 3 years listening to the whispers in the kitchens and the locker rooms. Your men don't hide their true faces from me. They think I'm part of the furniture. Taejuan let out a slow, measured breath. He saw the utility in her. His elite guards were trained to spot a sniper on a roof, but they were blind to the poison in the soup. To survive the night, he needed the girl who could calculate windage while pouring water. A deal, then, Taejuan said, leaning his knuckles against the mahogany desk. I will grant you full access to my private archives. The encrypted files even the level 5 clearance holders can't touch. Everything I know about your father's final hours, including the names of the contractors involved, will be yours. In exchange, you stay by my side. You become my eyes in the shadows. We find the mole together, and we excise them before the sun rises. Sorin stepped into the light, her hand extending across the desk. It was a small hand, but it held the power to topple his empire or save it. I want one more thing, she added, her eyes locking onto his. When we find the man who gave the order, his life belongs to me. Taejuan looked at her for a long, silent moment, recognizing the same, protected peace he had once sought for himself. He reached out and grasped her hand. The contact was clinical, a sealing of a pact made in the wreckage of a shattered room. Agreed, he said. The alliance was forged, a corporate tycoon and a ghost in an apron, bound by a shared history of betrayal and the sudden, violent necessity of survival. The mansion remained frozen, but beneath the surface, the gears of a different kind of justice had begun to turn. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold, shimmering with the fragile brilliance of Seoul's elite. For the men in the room, it was a stage for displays of dominance. For Taejuan, it was a hunting ground. He moved through the crowd with the heavy, silent grace of a predator, his navy suit tailored to perfection. But tonight, the most striking detail was the woman on his arm. Sorin had shed the black apron for a floor-length gown of midnight silk. Her hair, once tied in a utilitarian ponytail, now fell in soft waves that framed a face of startling, quiet intensity. She didn't look like a waitress elevated by a whim. She looked like a secret weapon finally unveiled. Taehwan could feel the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the sharp intake of breath, the frantic whispers behind gloved hands, and the confusion of his own lieutenants who stood like statues in the corners of the room. "Stay close," Taehwan murmured, his voice a low vibration beneath the strains of the live orchestra. "The mole won't be able to resist the sight of the witness he failed to eliminate." "He's already watching," Sorin replied, her voice steady and devoid of the awe expected of a guest. She didn't look at the chandeliers. Instead, her eyes scanned the room with the same clinical precision she had used to calculate the sniper's trajectory. "Table 4. Your head of security, Kong. He's adjusted his cufflink 3 times since we entered. He's not nervous about your safety. He's checking his transmitter." Taehwan led her toward the center of the floor, the silver of his wristwatch catching the light as he raised a glass of champagne. He looked every bit the corporate tycoon, but his senses were tuned to the vibration of the floorboards. He saw Kong, a man who had stood by him for a decade, pale slightly as their eyes met. Kong had been the one to authorize the armory codes. He was the man who thought he had buried Minho's legacy along with the man himself. As the music transitioned into a melancholic waltz, Taehwan pulled So-rin into the dance. They moved in a tight, disciplined circle, a calculated display of intimacy that served as a beckoning light to the shadows. "You're the bait," Taehwan said softly. "And you're the trap," she answered. Across the ballroom, Kong began to move, signaling to 2 men near the service entrance. They thought they were closing in on a vulnerable girl and a distracted boss. They didn't realize that in the Gala of Shadows, the most dangerous people were the ones who had already lived through the dark. The mansion frozen was melting now, but the heat wasn't from the candles. It was the beginning of a fire that would consume every traitor in the room. The transition from the ballroom to the secluded balcony was a calculated vulnerability. The air outside was sharp, smelling of salt and expensive perfume, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the gala. Taehwan stood with his back to the ornate stone railing, the silver of his wristwatch catching the moonlight as he lit a cigarette he didn't intend to finish. Beside him, So-rin leaned against the balustrade, her silhouette in the midnight silk gown looking like a shadow cast against the glowing city. "They're in position," So-rin whispered, her gaze never wavering from the darkened rooftop of the annex across the courtyard. She didn't look like a target. She looked like the bait that knew exactly when the shark would strike. Kang's men moved into the service corridor 3 minutes ago. The frequency on his transmitter just went silent. "That's the signal." Taehwan took a slow, measured drag, his eyes scanning the periphery. Then the theater begins. The second shot didn't come with the shattering of glass this time. It was the muffled, rhythmic thud of a suppressed rifle, a sound felt in the marrow of the bones rather than heard. A flower pot inches from Taehwan's shoulder exploded in a spray of ceramic and soil. In the same heartbeat, the frozen world of the mansion's security detail thawed into a choreographed counterstrike. Before the sniper could chamber a second round, the rooftop across the way was flooded with the blinding white light of tactical floods. Taehwan's loyalist shadow team, hidden in the vents and behind the parapets for hours, surged forward. "Go," Taehwan commanded, but he didn't move to cover. He stayed exactly where he was, a terrifyingly calm anchor in the center of the storm. Kong and his 2 enforcers burst through the balcony doors, weapons raised, expecting to find a dead tycoon and a screaming waitress. Instead, they found Taehwan still standing, his cigarette glowing in the dark, and So-rin holding a compact tactical tablet that glowed with the real-time feeds of their own betrayal. "You're late, Kong," Taehwan said, his voice as cold as the ocean below. The security chief froze, his eyes darting from his boss to the red laser dots now centered on his own chest. dots originating from the very men he thought he commanded. So-rin stepped forward, the silk of her dress rustling like a warning. She didn't look at the guns. She looked at the man who had signed the orders for her father's accident. "The windage was off tonight," she said, her voice a low, melodic blade. "But mine is perfect." The ambush was over before it truly began, the silence of the night returning as Kong was forced to his knees. The second shot had been fired, but for the first time in a decade, Taehwan wasn't the one bleeding. He looked at So-rin, and in the wreckage of the balcony, he saw the boy in the closet finally finding the strength to step out into the light. The descent into the mansion's sub-level archives felt like walking into the belly of a beast that Taehwan himself had fed for decades. The air here was thin and smelled of ozone, filtered through the hum of servers that contained every transaction, every betrayal, and every lie that sustained the Seoul Empire. Behind him, So-rin walked with a silence that was no longer that of a servant, but of a judge. Taehwan stood before the primary terminal, the silver of his wristwatch glinting in the blue glow of the monitors. With a series of keystrokes that felt like pulling teeth, he bypassed the final encryption layers, the ones Kong had believed were impenetrable. As the files unspooled, the architecture of his own life began to crumble. He had always believed that Minho's death was a tragic necessity of a war they were losing, a narrative carefully fed to him by his second-in-command. But the logs told a different story. The war had been manufactured. Kong hadn't just authorized the hit. He had spent 10 years systematically isolating Taehwan, whispering poison about loyal associates while pocketing the dividends of a shadow empire built on the bones of Minho's vision. Taehwan's grip on the edge of the desk tightened until the wood groaned. Every promotion he had granted, every traitor he had eliminated on Kang's advice, had been a brick in a prison of his own making. He hadn't been a tycoon. He had been a figurehead in a kingdom of ghosts. "He didn't just kill my father," So-rin said, her voice echoing off the cold steel walls. "He used your grief to turn you into a weapon against the very people who loved you." Taehwan didn't scream. He didn't rage. Instead, he began to work with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. He didn't just delete the files. He repurposed them. Using the administrative codes, he began to dismantle the hierarchy from the top down. He diverted the shadow accounts into a blind trust for the families of the men Kong had disappeared. He sent the evidence of a decade's worth of racketeering directly to the desks of the few prosecutors he knew were too stubborn to be bought. He was tearing down the walls of his fortress, stone by stone. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the untouchable Seoul organization would be nothing more than a memory, its assets liquidated and its secrets exposed. He turned to So-rin, his face a mask of exhausted clarity. "The debt is paid, not with blood, but with the truth that was stolen from you." He saw the tension finally leave her shoulders, a mirroring of the liberation he felt within himself. He had spent a lifetime building a cage of power, only to realize that the most potent act of strength was finally having the courage to burn it all down. The morning air over the Monterey coast was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of salt spray and the quiet promise of an ending. On the high balcony of the mansion, the jagged remains of the shattered window had been cleared away, leaving nothing but an unobstructed view of the horizon. The red laser dots and the shadows of gunmen were gone, replaced by the soft, gold-gray light of a dawn that felt earned rather than merely survived. Taehwan stood by the stone railing, his navy suit jacket discarded, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up as he looked out at the water. He no longer looked like a corporate tycoon or a mafia kingpin. He looked like a man who had finally put down a weight he had been carrying for 20 years. Beside him, So-rin leaned against the balustrade. The midnight silk gown was gone, replaced by a simple, comfortable sweater, her hair loose and catching the wind. The waitress uniform, the disguise of the invisible, had been left behind in the wreckage of the night. "The servers are dark," Taehwan said, his voice quiet, devoid of the gravelly command that once terrified his subordinates. The accounts are being distributed to the families. By noon, the name Seol Tae-hwan will mean nothing to the underworld. I am a man with no empire, So-rin. So-rin turned to him, her eyes reflecting the vastness of the sea. There was no clinical calculation in her gaze now, only a weary, peaceful recognition. And I am a woman with no ghost to hunt, she replied. My father's ledger is closed. For the first time in 10 years, I don't have to wonder who is standing behind me. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching a lone fishing boat cut through the swells in the distance. The mansion behind them, once a fortress of secrets and frozen hearts, now felt like nothing more than a house. Tae-hwan reached out, not with the possessive grip of a boss, but with the tentative grace of someone learning to connect again. His hand rested near hers on the cold stone. You saved my life for a truth, he murmured. I gave you the truth to save my soul. So-rin smiled, a small, genuine tilt of the lips that reached her eyes. It was a fair trade. In the quiet of the morning, they both understood that they were finally free. It wasn't the wealth or the dismantled hierarchy that had liberated them, but the moment they chose to see one another as more than a tycoon and a servant. They had been freed by a transaction that was never really about money or power, but about the simple, brave act of asking for help and the mercy of receiving it. As the sun finally broke over the waves, they stepped away from the railing together, leaving the ghosts of the mansion behind to walk into a world where they were finally, undeniably, equals. The story of Seol Tae-hwan and So-rin serves as a profound meditation on the nature of visibility and the true cost of power. In a world that often equates strength with the ability to dominate or the accumulation of wealth, the narrative reveals that real power lies in the courage to remain human in the face of systemic corruption. Tae-hwan's journey from a man shielded by luxury to a man liberated by truth reminds us that the most dangerous walls we encounter are often the ones we build around ourselves to keep the world at bay. When we prioritize control over connection, we become blind to the very people who possess the perspective to save us. The educational value of this narrative for a modern audience lies in its exploration of accountability and the breaking of cycles. It demonstrates that while the past cannot be rewritten, it can be redeemed through active repair. So-rin's refusal to become a victim or a mere instrument of vengeance highlights the importance of agency and strategic patience. Her character teaches us that being invisible in a society that values status is not a weakness, but a vantage point that allows for a clearer understanding of the truth. She didn't just survive her circumstances. She navigated them with a calculated dignity that eventually forced the most powerful man in her world to confront his own shadow. Ultimately, the story illustrates that justice is not always found in the strike of a sword or the firing of a weapon, but in the dismantling of the lies that allow injustice to thrive. It encourages the audience to look beyond the uniforms people wear, be they the tailored suits of the elite or the aprons of the service industry, to recognize the shared survival instincts that bind us all. The true transaction that occurred on that balcony was the exchange of isolation for partnership. It serves as a reminder that the bravest act anyone can perform is to ask for the truth, and the most honorable act is to provide it, regardless of what it costs our pride. In the end, we are all freed when we stop calculating what we are owed and start realizing what we are capable of giving.